The moment Patrick Easton rode into the dusty town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1878, he had one singular purpose burning behind his eyes, and it had nothing to do with mercy. The town of Caldwell sat like a rough-cut jewel at the edge of the Kishom Trail, where cattle dust perpetually hung in the air, and the smell of leather and horse sweat never quite left a man's lungs. It was a cattle town through and through, with a main street wide enough to turn a full wagon team, saloons that never truly closed, a mercantile, a livery stable, a small church with a crooked steeple, and the kind of hard-worn people who had staked everything on the promise of the frontier. Patrick had passed through a dozen towns just like it on his way south from Abilene, and he had barely noticed any of them. But Caldwell was different, because Caldwell was where the debt waited. He was 28 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Kansas plains. He wore a dusty brown hat with a sweat-stained band, a canvas coat that had seen better years, and boots that had logged more miles than most men dared think about. His horse, a dark bay gelding named Taft, moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of an animal that had learned not to waste energy on anything unnecessary. Patrick had been riding for 3 weeks, and every mile had stoked the coals of something cold and determined inside his chest. The debt in question was substantial, $500 to be precise, which in 1878 was not a small matter. It was the kind of money that could buy a man a good piece of land, or keep a family fed through 2 hard winters, or represent the entire profit of a season's work on the cattle drives. That $500 had belonged to Patrick's late father, Edmund Easton, who had loaned it in good faith to a man named Gerald Carter 11 years prior. Gerald had signed a promissory note with 2 witnesses present, promising repayment within 5 years with modest interest. Edmund Easton had died 4 years ago without ever seeing a cent of it returned. Patrick had inherited the note along with his father's small debts and the stubborn Easton conviction that a man settled what he owed. He had tracked Gerald Carter's movements across 3 counties before finally getting a solid lead that Carter had settled outside Caldwell and had been running a modest ranch operation for several years. Patrick had not come to be cruel. He had come to be paid. What he had not anticipated, and what Caldwell chose not to warn him about with any particular fanfare, was that Gerald Carter had been dead for 7 months. Patrick learned this from the barkeep at the Lone Star Saloon, a heavy-set man named Duffy who poured whiskey with the kind of practiced generosity that kept men talking. "Gerald Carter," Duffy repeated, setting a glass in front of Patrick without being asked. "Sure, I knew Gerald. Everybody knew Gerald. Hart gave out on him back in March, buried him out on his own property the way he wanted." Patrick stared at the glass. He did not reach for it immediately. "He left family, left a daughter," Duffy said, leaning on the bar. "Helen. She's been running the Carter place by herself since he passed. Well, not entirely by herself. She's got old Silas who works the horses and a woman named Rosa who helps with the house. But the decisions, the real work of keeping it alive, that's all Helen." Patrick turned the whiskey glass slowly on the bar top. $500 owed by a dead man. The law in Kansas was clear enough that debts could pass to an estate, but the practical reality of collecting from a grieving woman who was barely holding a ranch together was a different animal entirely. He had not come for cruelty, he reminded himself. He had come for what was his family's by right. "Where's the Carter place?" he asked. Duffy gave him directions that amounted to 3 miles south of town, a turn at the Cottonwood Grove, and a gate with the letter C burned into the crossbeam. Patrick thanked him, left 2 coins on the bar, and walked back out into the hard afternoon light without touching the whiskey. The ride to the Carter ranch was prettier than he expected. The land rolled gently here, not the brutal flat of the high plains but something softer, with yellow-gold grasses that moved like water in the wind, and a line of cottonwoods along a creek that cut through the property in a graceful curve. The gate was exactly where Duffy had described it, and beyond it, a hard-packed dirt road led to a farmhouse that was not grand but was clearly well tended, with a kitchen garden still showing late-season vegetables and a fence line that had been recently repaired. He was perhaps 50 yards from the house when the door opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was not what he had pictured. He was not sure what he had pictured exactly, perhaps something worn down and desperate, someone who looked like defeat. Instead, Helen Carter looked like someone who had been handed a very heavy thing and had decided to carry it without complaint. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot at her neck, wisps of it escaping at her temples in the afternoon breeze. She wore a blue work dress and an apron that told him she had been in the middle of something. Her hands, he noticed as he drew closer, were not soft hands. They were the hands of someone who worked. She did not look frightened. She looked cautious and a little tired, the way a person looks when they have learned that visitors can bring either good news or bad, and that the odds have not been particularly favorable lately. Patrick pulled Taft to a stop and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said. "I am looking for Helen Carter." "You found her," she said. Her voice was measured, not unfriendly but not open either. "And you are Patrick Easton. My father was Edmund Easton from Abilene." Something flickered across her face. Too quick for him to name it, but it was something. Recognition, or the shadow of it, maybe a name she had heard before in a conversation she had not been a part of. "You had better come in," she said. The inside of the Carter house was clean and spare, with practical furniture and a few small touches that told him a woman with taste lived here, even if she could not afford to indulge it often. A blue pottery pitcher on the kitchen shelf. A small framed embroidery above the fireplace that read something he could not quite make out from where he stood, the smell of bread baking and wood smoke. She did not offer him a seat immediately. She turned to face him with the kitchen table between them, which told him she understood that this was not a social call. "Your father loaned my father $500 in 1867, she said. "It was not a question." "He did, with a signed note." "I know about the note." She pressed her lips together briefly, looking at something past his left shoulder. "My father spoke of it. He always intended to pay it. With respect, Miss Carter, intention and payment are different things." She looked at him directly then, and he saw that her eyes were a clear hazel that caught the light in a way that was distracting if a man let himself be distracted, which he was determined not to be. There was no self-pity in them. There was something else, a kind of frank assessment that told him she was measuring the situation exactly as it was without flinching. "They are different things," she agreed. "I will not pretend otherwise. My father had debts he did not settle before he died, and this is one of them. The question is how you mean to address it." "I mean to be paid what was owed," Patrick said, "plus the interest agreed to in the note, which brings the total to $620. He watched the number land. He saw her breathe through it, slow and steady. "I do not have $620, she said quietly. "I have been operating this ranch at a loss since my father died. I have the land, I have 43 head of cattle, I have horses, I have equipment, and I have about $60 in savings. That is what I have." Patrick looked around the kitchen, then back at her. He had not come to ruin a woman's life. He had come to recover his family's money. But he also knew that allowing debts to go unpaid on the basis of sentiment was how a man ended up with nothing. "The note is legally enforceable," he said, not harshly but clearly. "The debt passed to the estate when your father died. I have the right to file a claim." "I know you do," she said. "I am not disputing your right. I am telling you my reality." They stood looking at each other across that kitchen table in the fading afternoon light, and Patrick had the strange sensation of standing at a crossroads that had not been on any map he had ever consulted. "What are you proposing?" he asked. She straightened her shoulders slightly. "I am proposing that you do not file a legal claim immediately. I have cattle going to market in the spring if the winter is decent and I do not lose too many head. A good drive could net me enough to begin repaying the debt significantly. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you for time. Time I have already extended, without any choice in the matter, for 11 years. I know that. And she said it without defensiveness, which was somehow worse than if she had argued with him. I know it is not your fault that my father did not pay. I know your family waited too long already. I am asking for more time anyway, because it is all I have to offer. Patrick set his hat on the kitchen table, a gesture he was not entirely aware of making until after it was done. He ran a hand through his hair, which was dark and needed cutting, and thought about his father, who had been a precise man with clear views about honesty and obligation. Edmund Easton had never once in his life allowed someone to take advantage of his patience. But Edmund Easton had also never in his life deliberately made a hard situation for a woman who was already carrying more than her fair share. "I will need to think on it," Patrick said finally. Helen Carter nodded. She did not look relieved exactly. She looked like a person who had learned not to count on things before they were settled. "There is a boarding house in town," she said. "Mrs. Alderman runs it. It is clean and she feeds well." "Thank you." He picked his hat back up, then paused. "I am sorry about your father, Miss Carter." She looked at him for a moment and something in her expression shifted just barely. "Thank you, Mr. Easton. My father was a complicated man, but I loved him very much." Patrick rode back to Caldwell in the long golden light of late afternoon, and he thought about a woman with hazel eyes and flour on her apron who had looked at him, as though she had decided he was a problem she was going to solve through sheer force of character. And he thought about Edmund Easton's promissory note folded carefully in the inside pocket of his coat. And he thought about the fact that nothing about this situation was turning out the way he had imagined it would. He stayed at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house, as Helen had suggested, paying $2 a week for a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the main street. Mrs. Alderman was a stout, cheerful widow of around 50 who ran her establishment with the organized efficiency of a military campaign and made breakfast at 6 every morning without fail. The other boarders were a traveling hardware salesman named Pettigrew, a young lawyer named Davies who was setting up a practice in town, and a retired trail hand named Boone who seemed to have no particular reason for being anywhere at all, which suited him perfectly. On his second morning in Caldwell, Patrick went to see the county clerk and made quiet inquiries about the Carter property's legal standing. What he learned was informative but not particularly encouraging for his cause. The ranch carried a mortgage with the Caldwell Bank, taken out by Gerald Carter 2 years before his death to cover operating costs during a dry season. Helen was current on the payments, just barely, but current. The property itself was worth perhaps $800, but with the bank's prior claim, there was not much left for a secondary creditor to attach. Filing a legal claim would likely result in a long court process that might yield him very little while devastating her entirely. He sat on the bench outside the clerk's office for a long time, watching Caldwell go about its business. Wagons moved through the street. 2 cowboys traded playful insults outside the saddle shop. A woman in a gray dress herded 3 small children toward the mercantile. A dog slept in a patch of sun near the livery, perfectly unbothered by the world. Patrick had spent the last 3 weeks being very certain about what he was going to do. He was considerably less certain now. On his 3rd day, without entirely meaning to, he rode back out to the Carter ranch. He found Helen in the corral, working with a young horse that had clearly not yet decided whether it trusted humans. She was not rough with it. She was patient and quiet, moving in slow circles around the animal with a long lead rope, letting it grow accustomed to her presence. The horse was a pretty roan, maybe 3 years old, and it was watching her with large dark eyes that held more intelligence than most people gave horses credit for. She noticed him at the fence and gave him a brief nod without interrupting what she was doing, which he respected. He leaned on the fence rail and watched for a while, and he noticed that she was genuinely good at this, that the horse had begun to lower its head and blow softly through its nose, which was the animal's way of letting go of tension. After a while, she led the roan to the far side of the corral, tied it loosely to the post there, and came to where Patrick stood. "You came back," she said. "I had some more thinking to do." "And how is the thinking going?" "Slowly," he admitted. She leaned her forearms on the fence rail beside him, close enough that he could smell the clean outdoor scent of her, sun and grass and something that might have been lavender soap. She was looking at the roan horse with an expression that was fond and calculating at the same time. "That horse is worth about $40 right now," she said. "In 6 months, if I have him properly gentled, he will be worth 80. That is what I am doing out here, building value where I can. You handle horses yourself?" "My father taught me. He said a woman who could handle horses could handle most anything." She paused. He was right about that at least. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I went to the county clerk yesterday. I expected you would. The situation is more complicated than I thought." She turned her head and looked at him with those clear hazel eyes. "I told you it was complicated." "You did. I did not fully appreciate it at the time." He pushed back from the fence and turned to face her more directly. "Miss Carter, I am going to be honest with you. I could file a legal claim. I have the right. But it would take a long time to work through the courts, and it would almost certainly cause you to lose the ranch, and even then I would likely collect a fraction of what is owed because of the prior bank mortgage. So collecting from me through the law would cost you more than it would earn you," she said, not bitterly, just accurately. "Yes, but that does not mean the debt disappears." "No," she agreed. "It does not mean that. So I am thinking," Patrick said carefully, "that perhaps we need to find a third way." She was very still for a moment. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwood trees by the creek, a sharp sound in the quiet afternoon. "What kind of third way?" "I do not know yet," he admitted. "But I am not inclined to destroy something that is clearly working, even if it is working on the edge of its limits. Your father owed my father a debt. That is real. But taking your livelihood does not honor my father's memory. It only creates a new injustice on top of an old one." Helen Carter looked at him for a long moment, and he could not read her expression precisely, but it was something more open than it had been before. "You could work for board," she said suddenly. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. I could not pay you wages worth speaking of, but if you were willing to work the ranch, I would credit the value of your labor against the debt. And at the end of the drive season in spring, whatever money the cattle bring, I would pay you what I could from that as well. It would not clear the debt entirely by spring, but it would show progress. Real progress." Patrick stared at her. It was not the proposal he had anticipated. It was not the proposal he would have invented in 1,000 years of standing at the fence of a stranger's corral. But there was a peculiar logic to it that he could not dismiss. "You are asking me to become your ranch hand," he said. "I am asking you to become a partner in collecting your own debt," she corrected, with a precision that told him she had a sharp mind and was not embarrassed about it. "The more work gets done here, the more value there is. More value means I can pay more. It serves both of us." He looked out over the ranch, the pasture where the cattle grazed, the barn that needed a new board or two on the south wall, the fence that stretched along the creek. It was modest, but it was solid, and he could see, if he looked honestly, that it could be genuinely productive with enough hands and enough time. He thought about Abilene, where he had a room over a feed store and a part-time job checking freight. He thought about Edmund Easton's promissory note. "All right," Patrick said. "I will stay through the winter and into spring. We will assess in April." Helen Carter held out her hand, and he shook it, and her grip was firm and direct, the handshake of someone who meant what they said. "You can take the room in the barn loft," she said. "It is dry and it has a stove, better than it sounds. I have slept in worse." "So have I," she said, and turned back to the roan horse with what he could have sworn was the very beginning of a smile. He moved in that afternoon. Rosa, Helen's housekeeper and friend, was a capable Mexican woman of about 40 with dark, sharp eyes, and a manner that told Patrick she was assessing him thoroughly, and would not be shy about sharing her conclusions if she found him wanting. She gave him a blanket for the loft and a plate of supper without being asked, which he took to mean he had passed the initial inspection. Silas, the ranch hand who had worked for the Carters for 12 years, was quieter in his judgment but shook Patrick's hand with solid respect and showed him where everything was kept without wasting words. The first week was straightforward work. Patrick repaired the south wall of the barn, restrung 2 sections of fence line along the creek pasture, and helped Silas move the cattle to the winter grazing ground, which was a sheltered area on the south side of a low ridge where the grass lasted longer, and the wind was not as punishing. He worked hard and without complaint, which seemed to be the currency that earned the most respect on the Carter ranch. Helen worked harder than him. That was the honest truth of it, and he noticed it without particular surprise but with considerable respect. She was up before him most mornings, getting the kitchen garden prepared for the coming frost, working with the horses, reviewing the account books in the evenings with a lamp and a pencil, and the focused expression of someone trying to make numbers behave that they did not naturally want to behave. She managed the operation with a competence that was impressive for anyone, regardless of age or circumstance, and the fact that she had kept it alive through 7 months of widowhood while servicing a bank mortgage on her own told him everything he needed to know about the kind of person she was. They talked, initially, the way working people talk about practical things. Which fence section needed attention next? Whether the weather was going to turn early? What price the cattle might bring in spring if the market held? Rosa and Silas were present at mealtimes, so the conversations around the table were general and easy. But gradually, in the smaller moments, when it was just the two of them on the porch in the early morning or riding the fence line together in the afternoon, the conversations grew into something with more shape. It started with horses. They both loved horses, and a shared love of something is as good a bridge between two people as anything else. She told him about the roan's progress, and he offered observations from trail driving experience about how certain horses responded to different handling methods. She listened with genuine interest, which surprised him slightly, since he had learned early in life that some people listen in order to wait for their turn to speak, while others listen as though they actually intend to use what they hear. Helen was the latter kind. He told her about his life in Abilene, which was not exciting but was honest. He had been a drover on the trail drives for 4 years after his father died, and then he had stepped off the trail because his body had told him it was time to stop sleeping on the ground every night. He had done freight work, some carpentry, odd jobs of the kind a capable man could always find in a cattle town. He had been saving money toward land of his own, though the $500 gap in his savings from his father's uncollected loan had made that slower going than it might have been otherwise. "You gave up the trail for your body's sake," Helen said one afternoon as they were riding along the east fence line. "How old were you?" 25. "You do not seem like a man who gives up on things easily." "I am not," he said. "I prefer to think of it as adjusting strategy rather than surrendering." She laughed at that, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh without any restraint in it, genuinely and fully amused, and the sound of it did something unexpected to the inside of his chest that he chose not to examine too closely at the moment. "My father used to say something similar," she said, when the laughter had settled. "He said the difference between stubbornness and determination was whether you were pointed in the right direction." Smart man. She was quiet for a moment. He was in his way. He was also careless in his way. He borrowed money when he should not have, and he trusted his own optimism more than the actual state of things, and he left me with a great deal to manage that I might have managed better with more warning. She did not say it with anger. It was the tone of someone who had worked through the grief and arrived at something more complicated and more honest on the other side. But he was kind, and he was funny, and he genuinely loved this land, so I am keeping it. Because of him. "Because of me," she said, "because I love it too." The first frost came in late October, and with it came the particular hard beauty of Kansas in the early cold, where the light turned a crystalline gold and the grass went silver at night, and the sky in the mornings was a color that had no good name but that you would recognize anywhere as belonging to the high plains in autumn. Patrick found himself, in those weeks, more present than he had been anywhere in several years. He could not easily identify when exactly his feelings for Helen Carter had begun to change in character, because it was not the kind of thing that happened in a single moment, but rather the kind of thing that accumulates, the way frost accumulates, quietly and persistently until one morning you look and the world has transformed. He knew he admired her. That had come early. The admiration had been almost impersonal at first, the respect one capable person extends to another. But somewhere in the quiet weeks of working beside her, of watching her handle a difficult situation with patience and intelligence and a wry humor that surfaced when you least expected it, the admiration had grown roots that went somewhere deeper than his respect. He noticed the small things, the way she tucked her loose hair back behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way she always thanked Rosa and Silas for their work specifically, not in a general way, but by naming the particular thing they had done well, which told him she paid attention. The way she read in the evenings by lamplight, with a kind of focused pleasure that made the book look like good company. The way she stood at the edge of the porch in the early mornings, coffee cup in hand, looking out at the land with an expression that was half love and half determination. He was careful with what he noticed. He had come here on a debt collection, and the situation was not uncomplicated. He was not a man who confused his feelings with the circumstances that had created them. He kept working, kept talking to her the way they talked, and kept whatever else was developing in the quieter parts of himself properly managed. He was somewhat less successful at this than he hoped. November brought a cold snap that tested everything on the ranch. 3 days of driving sleet that turned the yard to mud and made the cattle restless and huddled. Patrick and Silas spent most of those days in the barn and the pasture, checking on the herd, pulling 2 calves that had gotten stuck in a muddy low spot near the creek, hauling hay out to the far pasture when the cattle were reluctant to move in the bad weather. It was exhausting, unglamorous work, the kind that stiffened every muscle and left a man too tired in the evenings to do anything but sit by the fire with his boots drying on the hearth. Helen made soup during those days, large pots of it that Rosa kept on the stove around the clock, and there was always a bowl warm and ready when Patrick or Silas came in cold from the weather. It was a small thing, but the cumulative warmth of being fed when you were frozen through, consistently and without any fuss about it, was not a small feeling. On the 3rd night of the sleet, after Silas had gone to his small cabin at the edge of the property and Rosa had gone to bed, Patrick sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and Helen sat across from him going over the account books, which she had a habit of doing in the evening. The sleet tapped at the windows. The lamp made a warm circle on the table between them. "We are going to lose approximately $8 in hay this week," she said without looking up. "More if the cold holds." "It should break by Friday," Patrick said. "The clouds have been shifting." She made a small mark in her ledger. "How do you know weather like that? 4 years on the trail, you learn to read it." She looked up then, pen in hand. What else did you learn on the trail? He thought about it. To sleep anywhere. To eat anything without complaint. To judge a man's character faster than is comfortable. To appreciate a hot meal more than most people can imagine. He paused. To be alone for long periods without losing yourself to it. She was quiet for a moment. That last one is a harder skill than it sounds. It is, he agreed. I have been learning it this year, she said. There was no self-pity in it, just the straightforward accounting of experience. It is better to be busy. The nights are the difficult part. Yes, he said, and then, because something in the honesty of the moment seemed to call for it, he said, I have noticed that you are very strong, Miss Carter. I do not mean that as a compliment to make you feel better. I mean it as an observation. She looked at him with those steady hazel eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Easton. I have noticed that you are more careful than you first appeared." "How do you mean careful?" "When you came here," she said slowly, "I thought you were a hard man who had come to take what was owed him regardless of what it cost, and you had every right to be that, but you are not actually that man." Patrick held the coffee mug and looked at the grain of the wooden table. "I have tried to be at times. It is a useful thing to be out here." "It is," she agreed. "But it is not the same as being a good man, and you are that." The silence between them was warm and a little charged, and Patrick was very aware of how small the kitchen was and how close the table put them and what the lamplight did to the color of her hair. He stood up with a degree of deliberateness. "I should get back to the barn," he said. "Check on the horses before I turn in." "Patrick," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice, quiet and sure, made him go very still. "Yes," he said. She seemed to consider something, then said, "Thank you for staying, for working as hard as you have. I know it was not what you planned." "No," he agreed, "it was not." He went back out into the sleet, and he stood for a moment in the cold dark between the house and the barn, feeling the icy mist on his face, and thought that nothing in his life had ever prepared him for this particular situation, and that he was very far behind on understanding what was happening to him. November wore into December, and the cold settled in properly, the way Kansas cold does, with a flat, serious intention that did not leave much room for argument. The sleet had stopped, but the temperature dropped, and the work on the ranch shifted to the rhythms of winter maintenance, keeping the water sources from freezing, feeding the cattle adequately with the hay stocks, making sure the horses were properly sheltered. The weeks had created a comfortable intimacy between Patrick and the people of the ranch that he had not anticipated. He and Silas had developed the easy understanding of two working men who trusted each other's competence. Rosa had decided, around the third week, that Patrick was acceptable, which she expressed by occasionally setting aside a particular piece of bread or cake for him specifically, a high honor that Patrick understood without having to be told. And Helen and he had moved, gradually and without explicit discussion, from the formal Miss Carter and Mr. Easton into first names, which felt both natural and significant in a way that neither of them commented on. The town of Caldwell saw him periodically when he came in for supplies, and he became, in the way of small communities, a known quantity, the man from Abilene staying at the Carter place. Duffy at the Lone Star nodded to him as though he had always been a local. The young lawyer Davies greeted him on the street. Mrs. Alderman still kept his former room available, which he suspected was her way of ensuring she had the right information about his intentions. One evening in mid-December, there was a community dance at the church hall. Helen mentioned it in a matter-of-fact way over supper, saying that Rosa and Silas were planning to go, and that it would be a good opportunity for Patrick to meet more of the townspeople. She said she herself was not certain she would attend, that there was mending to do. Patrick looked at the top of her head as she concentrated on her plate and thought that mending could wait. "I would like it very much if you would come to the dance," he said. She looked up with that quick, assessing look she had. "Would you?" "I would. I would like to dance, and I would not want to do it with someone I do not know." The corner of her mouth moved. "That is a very practical reason. I am a practical man." She came to the dance. She wore a green dress he had not seen before, with her hair down and pinned back more loosely than her usual work style. And Patrick spent the first 10 minutes after arriving being introduced to people. He immediately forgot because his attention kept tracking back to her. She moved through the room with a contained ease that told him she was comfortable here, that these were her people and she knew how to be among them. And he watched the way the town treated her, with a combination of respect and affection that said everything about how she had conducted herself through the hard year. He danced with her twice, which was probably once more than was strictly appropriate for a man in his situation, and he was not sorry. The hall was warm and the fiddler was competent, and the floor was crowded with people who were glad for the chance to be festive in the middle of a hard winter, and when he held her hand for the reel and they moved through the patterns of the dance, he was very happy and tried not to show it too obviously. On the walk back from the dance, Silas and Rosa walked ahead, talking in the companionable quiet of people who have known each other for years, and Patrick and Helen walked behind them in the cold, clear night. The sky was enormous and bright, the way the plain sky gets when the air is very cold and very still. "You are a fair dancer," Helen said. "I had good teachers. There was a woman in Abilene who ran a boarding house and gave dancing lessons on Saturday afternoons. She believed that a man who could not dance was missing something essential. She was not wrong." "No," he agreed. "She was not." They were quiet for a moment. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Helen," he said. "Yes." He chose his words with the care he had been developing over the weeks of working alongside her, learning what she meant when she said things, and how she listened when other people said them. "I want to be clear with you about something because I think clarity matters to you and because I think you deserve it." She had gone slightly still beside him, the way she did when she was paying full attention. "I came here to collect a debt," he said. "That is a fact that has not changed, and I do not want you to think that anything between us since has been a tactic or a strategy. What I feel for you is not connected to the debt. I want to say that plainly." He stopped walking and she stopped beside him. Silas and Rosa were a good distance ahead now, out of easy hearing. "What do you feel?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. He looked at her face in the starlight, which made her look like something a man might dream about when he was cold and alone on the trail. "I think you know. I would like to hear it." "I love you," he said, with the directness of a man who was not used to saying such things but who meant every word of what he did say. "I know the circumstances are complicated. I know I came here as a creditor, and I know the balance of things between us is not simple. But I want you to know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with the note in my pocket and everything to do with you. The person you are, the way you handle hard things, the way you look at your horses and your land, the way you are honest even when a softer version of the truth would serve you better." Helen Carter stood very still under the vast Kansas sky, and for a moment she said nothing at all, and he braced himself for any number of responses, ranging from gentle rejection to outright refusal, and found that he had no prepared reply for any of them because whatever she said, he would simply have to hear it and reckon with it honestly. "I have been trying," she said finally, "to separate what I feel from the situation we are in, because I worried it was gratitude or relief or simply the result of spending a great deal of time with someone who is genuinely kind when I did not expect kindness." She paused. "But it is not those things, or it is not only those things. What I feel for you is its own thing, separate from gratitude. I want to be honest about that." "Are you saying what I think you are saying?" he asked. "I am saying," she said clearly, "that I love you too, Patrick, and I am also saying that I am afraid of it because the last year has taught me how much there is to lose." He reached out and took her hand, which was cold through her glove, and held it. "I understand being afraid," he said. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I am only asking you to know how I feel." She looked at their joined hands and then back up at him. "I know how you feel. And you know how I feel. What do we do with that? We are patient," he said, "and we keep being honest, and we see what grows." She made a sound that was half laugh and half something more tender. "You sound like a gardener talking about a very uncertain crop." "I grew up helping my father with a vegetable garden," he said. "The patience is real." She laughed, properly this time, and he stood in the cold night holding her hand and listening to it, and thought that he was very far from the man he had been when he rode into this town 6 weeks ago with a cold purpose and a single destination. Christmas came to Caldwell with a surprising warmth, despite the hard cold of the Kansas winter. The church organized a community dinner on Christmas Day, and Helen brought pies. Rosa brought tamales that disappeared within the first hour. Silas sat with a group of older ranch hands and traded stories. Patrick found himself standing with the young lawyer Davies and 2 local ranchers, talking cattle prices and land values, and he felt, for the first time in years, like he was somewhere he actually wanted to be rather than somewhere he was passing through. He gave Helen a present on Christmas morning, before the community dinner. He had made it himself over several evenings in the barn loft, using a piece of well-grained walnut he had bought from the hardware store and the small carving knife he carried. It was a horse, small enough to fit in her palm, the roan's particular head shape with its large eye and the slight lift of the nose, and he had spent more time on it than he probably should have, getting the details right. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "You made this," she said. It was not a question. "I have been known to carve things when I cannot sleep." She closed her fingers around it carefully. "It is the roan. It is." She looked up at him with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life, full of something that was warm and a little undone. And she said, "Patrick." And then she stepped forward and kissed him on the cheek with a soft intentionality that was entirely different from any accidental proximity they had shared. And he stood very still and let the moment be exactly what it was. "Thank you," she said. "This is the best gift I have received in many years." "You are welcome," he said, and his voice was somewhat less steady than usual, and he was not embarrassed about it. She gave him a pair of gloves she had made herself, lined with flannel, precisely fitted because she had borrowed one of his old gloves to measure from while he slept. They fit perfectly. He wore them every day for the rest of the winter. January and February were the deep, cold months, when the wind came straight down from the north without anything on the plains to soften it, and the days were short and the nights were very long, and the work contracted to the essential core of keeping everything alive. Patrick and Silas settled into a steady rotation of checking the cattle, keeping the water tank from freezing with regular breaking of the ice that formed overnight, hauling feed, and maintaining the barn. The roan horse was now fully gentled and responding beautifully to more advanced training, and Patrick worked with it alongside Helen in the hours when the weather permitted, which was less often than either of them would have liked. But the indoor hours, the evenings around the table after supper, were good in their own particular way. Helen read aloud sometimes, which he loved, her voice moving through passages of whatever book she was working through with a clarity that made the words feel like they had more weight than they carried on the page alone. He told her stories from the trail, edited for the most violent parts, and she was an excellent audience, asking specific questions at the right moments that told him she was building a real picture of the life he described rather than just being politely attentive. Silas and Rosa were, by now, perfectly aware of the nature of what was developing between Patrick and Helen, and they managed this knowledge with the discretion of people who had lived long enough to understand that the right thing to do with someone else's happiness was to protect it without interfering. Rosa occasionally left the room with unnecessary purposes when conversations between Patrick and Helen were deepening. Silas developed a habit of being very interested in things at the far end of the barn during certain evening hours. Neither of them said a word about any of it, which spoke well of them both. In the first week of February, on a still, cold evening when the snow on the ground caught the last light and the sky had gone a deep clear blue before the dark came down, Patrick asked Helen if she would walk with him to the creek. She put on her coat and her scarf without asking why, which he took as a good sign. The creek was frozen solid, a smooth white path through the cottonwood trees, and the bare branches of the trees were black against the blue dusk sky. Their boots crunched on the snow. It was very quiet. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." He stopped walking and turned to face her. She was rosy from the cold, her breath making small clouds between them. "I want to ask you to marry me." She was very still. "I know," he said, because she had not spoken yet, "that this is complicated by the debt, and I want to be clear that I am not proposing as a solution to the debt. The debt is a separate matter. I am proposing because I love you and because I believe we could build something genuinely good together. I am proposing because I want to wake up on this land with you for the rest of my life and work beside you and argue with you about horse training methods and listen to you read aloud in the evenings. He paused. "I am proposing because you are the finest person I have met in my entire life, and I cannot imagine going back to Abilene and living the way I was living before." Helen Carter stood in the snow by the frozen creek and looked at him with her clear hazel eyes, and then she said, "What about the debt? What about it? You came here to collect money. If we marry, there is no logical way to do that. I know. $620 is a significant sum to surrender. I know that too." He held her gaze. "I am not surrendering it exactly. I am concluding that I have already received something of considerably more value, and that the accounting on this matter has resolved itself in a way my father would not have predicted but might have approved of." She was quiet for a long moment. A breath of wind moved through the cottonwood branches above them. "He came to take what was owed him," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "and left owing her everything." Patrick looked at her. "What did you say?" "Something Rosa said to me last week. She said he came to take what was owed him, and now he is the one who owes everything. I think she was talking about you." He considered this. "She is not wrong." Helen smiled, and it was the fullest, most unguarded smile he had seen from her, without any of the careful management she usually applied to her own expressions, just genuinely, completely happy. "Yes," she said. "Yes to which part?" "Yes, I will marry you, Patrick Easton, on the condition that we are always honest with each other, that you do not make any major decisions about this ranch without talking to me first, and that you agree the roan horse belongs to me when he is sold." "Those are very specific terms. I am a very specific person." "You are the most specific person I have ever known," he said, and he stepped forward and took her face in his cold hands and kissed her properly, with all the accumulated warmth of the winter months that had somehow managed to be the warmest winter of his life. And she kissed him back with the kind of certainty that meant she had thought about it and decided fully. And the frozen creek and the bare trees and the darkening Kansas sky were witness to all of it. Rosa cried when they told her. She denied it immediately and then cried again, and then composed herself and began planning the wedding dinner with an efficiency that suggested she had been ready for this moment for some time. Silas shook Patrick's hand with a grip that bordered on painful and said, "Good," which was the most fulsome praise Silas had ever offered on any subject, and Patrick understood it as the tremendous endorsement it was. They were married in March, in the Caldwell church with the crooked steeple, on a morning when the sky had finally relented and turned the deep, honest blue of a plain spring arriving, and the light was brilliant, and the mud in the churchyard had dried enough to be navigable. Helen wore the green dress from the dance, which Rosa had altered and added a length of cream-colored lace at the collar, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that she had found by the creek that morning with what appeared to be deliberate casualness, but was almost certainly the result of a private walk in the very early hours. Patrick wore his best coat, which Rosa had brushed and pressed with such thorough attention that it looked nearly new, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Helen walk toward him with Silas at her side, since she had no father to walk with her, and there were perhaps 30 people in the pews of that small church, and none of them existed for him at that moment. There was only the woman coming toward him in green and cream and early spring flowers, walking with that contained, determined grace that had first caught his notice when she stepped out onto her porch and looked at him with cautious eyes. And his chest was full of something that did not have a precise word in any language he knew, but that felt like arriving home. The minister was a compact man named Reverend Aldous, who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and who had the voice of a man twice his size. And he performed the ceremony with a warmth that told Patrick he liked Helen Carter very much and was pleased about what was happening. When Patrick put the ring on Helen's finger, a simple band of gold that he had bought from the jeweler in Caldwell 2 weeks earlier and had kept in his coat pocket until this moment, her hand was entirely steady in his. The reception was at the Carter Ranch, which was now formally the Easton Ranch as well, though as Helen had rightly pointed out during one of their planning conversations, The name Carter had been on that land for 10 years, and she felt no particular urgency to erase it, which Patrick agreed with entirely. Rosa had been cooking for 3 days. The long table was set up outside in the yard in the spring sunshine, and there was more food than 30 people could comfortably finish, which was exactly how Rosa believed it should be. The fiddler from the Christmas dance was persuaded to come out and play, and the yard became, for an afternoon, a very good place to be alive. Patrick danced with his wife 3 times, which was now entirely appropriate, and he watched her laugh with the neighbor women and talk horses with 2 of the local ranchers, and sit with Rosa on the porch bench for a few minutes in a quiet conversation that involved a good deal of hand-holding on both sides. And he thought that he had come into this town with a cold purpose and an old piece of paper, and had been entirely remade by it. The debt, practically speaking, dissolved. Patrick tore up the promissory note on the day of their wedding in front of Helen, by the kitchen stove. He fed it to the fire without ceremony. She watched it burn and then looked at him with an expression that acknowledged every complexity of the situation without requiring a word to be said about any of it. "Your father's money is accounted for," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is more than accounted for." Spring came fully in April, and with it the cattle drive preparation that Helen had been planning since the previous autumn. With Patrick's additional labor and the preparations they had made through the winter, the herd was in better condition than it might have been, and Silas had contacts from his old trail driving days who helped them arrange connection with a larger outfit heading north to Dodge City for the market. It was not a large drive, 41 head after the winter losses, but the price held well, and when the accounting was done, it represented the first genuinely profitable season the Carter Ranch had seen in 3 years. The bank mortgage payment was made in full, with 2 months ahead in reserve. Patrick spent an afternoon going over the accounts with Helen, both of them at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, working through what the season had earned and what the next year's plans should be. "If we buy 5 more breeding stock this fall," Helen said, running her finger down a column of figures, "and the spring is good, we could drive 15 more head next season. And if we plant the south pasture with better grass seed," Patrick added, "the cattle condition improves over the winter. Better condition means better price. We would need the money for the seed now. I have money saved from the freight work in Abilene," he said. "It is not a great deal, but it is enough for seed and 5 head of decent breeding stock." She looked at him across the table with a specific expression he had learned to recognize, which was the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to accept help gracefully or insist on independence unnecessarily. "That is your personal savings," she said. "That is our money now," he said. "We are married, Helen." She pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was working something out. Then she said, "I will put in the equivalent value of my labor assessment on the north fence expansion, which I had been planning to hire out. That way the contribution is mutual. You are the most contractually minded person I have ever met." "In business matters, yes," she said. "In other matters, somewhat less so." "In which other matters are you less contractually minded?" She looked at him with those hazel eyes that he would never entirely get used to, the way they caught light and held something complicated and warm behind the clarity. "Come to bed," she said. "I will show you." The summer was the best season the ranch had seen in years, by several measurable standards. The grass grew well. The breeding stock settled into the pasture and thrived. The roan horse, now fully trained, was sold to a rancher north of town for $85, which beat Helen's projection by $5 and pleased her enormously. The north fence was expanded, and the south pasture received its new grass seed, and by August there were 30 additional acres of well-managed grazing land that had not existed in the ranch's productive capacity the previous year. Patrick discovered, over those summer months, that he loved this land in a way he had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. He had grown up in Abilene, which was a town, and not truly a cattle town in the way he had imagined as a boy. The open work of the ranch, the daily relationship with the land and the animals and the seasons, connected something in him that the freight work and the trail driving had only partially touched. He was building something here, with someone he loved, on ground that was becoming his in the way that ground only becomes a person's when they work it and care for it over time. He and Helen had their first genuine argument in June about whether to replace the barn roof before or after the south fence expansion. It was a practical disagreement, and it was conducted with the directness of two people who did not soften their opinions for the sake of comfort, and it was resolved through a compromise that left neither of them entirely satisfied, which Patrick had learned was the signature of a genuine negotiation between equals. They did not stay angry. They did not go to bed with the argument unresolved. They had, without explicitly deciding to, arrived at the practice of clearing things between them before the day ended. Rosa stayed with them through the summer and into the fall, which was her choice and their great relief. She had been with the Carter family for 6 years, and the ranch was as much her home as anywhere in the world. She began, in late summer, receiving letters from a cousin in Santa Fe who was trying to persuade her to come and help with his restaurant business, and she gave Patrick and Helen a good deal of trouble about this decision, changing her mind approximately 4 times a week. "Go," Helen finally told her, in a firm and loving way one August afternoon. "Go and see your cousin and decide when you get there. But know that if you want to come back, there will always be a place for you here." Rosa went in September, with tears and extensive instructions for Helen about the proper way to season the stew, which instructions Helen received respectfully and would almost certainly modify based on her own taste, because she was that kind of person. Rosa wrote in October saying she had decided to stay in Santa Fe, where the weather was considerably more forgiving than Kansas in the winter, and she was happy. Helen read the letter aloud to Patrick, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "She was always meant for warmer weather," Helen said. "Yes," Patrick agreed. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the way she had developed a habit of doing, with a comfortable trust that still moved him. "She was right about us, though. She usually was." They hired a young woman named June in October to help with the house, the daughter of a neighboring family who was sensible and good-natured and quick to learn, and the rhythm of the ranch adjusted around her presence with the ease of a system that was now fundamentally solid. In November, Helen told Patrick she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning with the straightforward manner that was entirely characteristic of her, holding a coffee cup and looking at him with that clear-eyed gaze and saying, "I believe we are going to have a baby in the spring." She said it plainly and waited for his response with the slight tension in her shoulders that told him she was not as calm as she appeared. He set down his own cup and crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands in his, and what he felt was so large and unstructured that it took him a moment to find anything to say. "Helen," he said finally, which was not particularly articulate, but she seemed to understand it precisely. "I know," she said, and she smiled, fully and without reservation, the smile he had fallen in love with. He held her in the kitchen while the morning light came through the window and the coffee grew cold on the table, and he thought about the improbable chain of events that had led a man with a promissory note in his pocket to this kitchen, this woman, this child growing toward a spring he was going to count every day to meet. The winter of 1879 was mild by Kansas standards, which felt like grace. Patrick was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance Helen made clear she required in terms that left no room for ambiguity. She continued to work the ranch through the winter in the ways she was capable of, and insisted that being pregnant was not the same as being unwell. This was true, and Patrick knew it was true, and he respected it while quietly doing more of the heavier physical work in ways he hoped appeared casual. Silas noticed and said nothing, which was his particular form of wisdom. The baby arrived in late April, in the season of new grass and returning birdsong, delivered by the town doctor and Rosa, who had come back from Santa Fe for the occasion because Helen had written to say she was needed, which was all Rosa had ever required to come. It was a boy. He came into the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined eyes, and he announced himself with a vigor that the doctor said approvingly was a very good sign. They named him Edmund, for Patrick's father, with James as a middle name, for a Carter grandfather who had first come to Kansas on a wagon from Ohio 30 years before, which felt to both of them like the right way to honor the intertwined history that had brought them together. Patrick held his son in the barn loft that evening, after Helen was resting and the doctor had gone, and Rosa was contentedly reinstalled in the kitchen as though she had never left. He sat in the straw with little Edmund bundled in the wool blanket Rosa had knitted over the winter, the lamp burning low and the horses breathing softly in the stalls below, and he thought about Edmund Easton of Abilene, who had trusted a man with $500 and a signed note, and had died without seeing it returned. The debt, Patrick thought, had been paid back in the most unexpected currency imaginable. He thought about the day he had ridden into Caldwell with cold certainty and a single purpose, and the woman who had stepped onto her porch and looked at him without flinching. He thought about the kitchen table and the promissory note, and the first time he had heard her laugh without any restraint. He thought about the starlit walk and the frozen creek and the green dress at the Christmas dance. He thought about everything that had grown from the unlikely seed of a debt that could not be collected. His son made a small sound in his sleep, a contented sigh, and Patrick looked down at the new face and felt the full weight of everything he had received, the land under his feet, the woman who had married him with specific conditions and a clear heart, the child asleep in his arms. He had come to take what was owed him. What he had found and what had taken root in him was more than he had ever known to want. Rosa stayed through the summer, genuinely unable to leave, which was what everyone had privately predicted. She said she would only stay until Helen was fully recovered and settled, and then she revised this to say she would stay until young Edmund was sleeping through the night reliably, and then she stayed through the first mowing season because there was simply too much to do. In August, she received a letter from her cousin in Santa Fe that apparently said something that resolved her dilemma permanently, and she emerged from her room with the news that she was not going back to Santa Fe after all, because her cousin had found other help for the restaurant and Rosa had decided she was exactly where she belonged. Helen received this news with a composure that was slightly undermined by the brightness of her eyes and said, "We would need to properly expand the back room if you stay permanently." "Then expand it," Rosa said, with the air of someone who has decided something and moved on to practicalities. Patrick built the room expansion in September, and it was solid and well-fitted, with a south-facing window that got good light in the mornings, and Rosa declared it acceptable, which was her highest register of praise. The ranch continued to grow in the measured way of a well-managed operation, not dramatically but steadily, the way that actually lasts. The herd increased. The south pasture produced well. Patrick took on a second part-time hand, a quiet young man named Eli who was 17 when they hired him and turned 18 before the end of that first season, who had grown up on a farm in Missouri and knew livestock and was eager to learn more. He boarded in the barn loft that had once been Patrick's own first home on this property, and he ate supper with the household on most evenings, and he was good with young Edmund, who by his first birthday was pulling himself to standing and regarding the world with the focused intensity that was entirely his mother's. Silas, who had been with the Carter family longer than anyone, continued as the senior hand with an authority that was unspoken and unquestioned, and that he wore with the ease of a man who has found exactly where he fits in the world. He had a particular way with young Edmund that involved very quiet conversation, conducted on the assumption that the baby understood everything being said, which Edmund seemed to, or at least he paid attention with a seriousness that suggested he was taking it in. Christmas of 1880 was a full house and a long table. Rosa had been cooking for 3 days again. June, the household help, had become so comfortable with the family that she was more of a household member than an employee, and she was currently being courted by the young lawyer Davies, which the entire town of Caldwell seemed to find amusing and appropriate. Silas was there, and Eli, and 2 neighboring families with children who ran through the yard in the mild December afternoon. Edmund was 8 months old and very pleased with the lights and the noise, and the many people who wanted to hold him, which he submitted to with the regal patience of someone who expects attention and finds it reasonable. Patrick stood on the porch in the early afternoon, before the dinner, with a cup of coffee and Edmund bundled against his chest in the way the boy liked best, warm and high up where he could see things. The yard was full of people and children and the sounds of a good day being had, and beyond the fence the winter land stretched in its clean, spare beauty, the grass gone gold and silver, the cottonwoods bare but graceful, the sky the particular blue of a cold and clear Kansas December. Helen came out onto the porch with her own coffee and stood beside him, close enough to be warm. She looked at the yard and the land beyond it with the expression she always had when she looked at this place, the complex love that included the hard parts as clearly as the beautiful ones. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the word did not seem quite large enough for what he meant, but it was the right word. "Yes," he said, "I am very happy." She leaned her head against his shoulder, carefully so as not to disturb Edmund, who had closed his eyes against Patrick's chest with the total confidence of someone who knows exactly where he is safe. "I was thinking," she said, "about the fact that you came here to take money from me. I am aware of the irony." "It is not irony exactly," she said. "It is more like a story that knew how it wanted to end before the people in it did." Patrick considered this. Edmund breathed steadily against his chest. The voices from the yard were warm and close. "Your father left a debt. I came to collect it, and instead, she finished quietly, you stayed and built and loved, and owed it all to the girl who had nothing to pay you with but time and honesty and a stubborn piece of land." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Worth considerably more than $620, he said, "as it turns out." She laughed softly, and he felt it as much as heard it, a warmth that lived in the simplest and most essential place inside him. Spring came again, as it always did on the Kansas plains, first as a rumor in the quality of the light, then as a loosening in the frozen ground, then finally in the full green rush of grass and birdsong, and the particular smell of wet earth that is one of the best smells in the world if you have spent enough winters waiting for it. Edmund learned to walk in March, making the determined, slightly precarious progress across the kitchen floor that reduced both Patrick and Helen to a state of joyful alarm, always right there with hands half extended, ready to catch him, but letting him take the steps himself. The second drive of the season in May went north with 47 head, and returned with the best profit the ranch had seen, enough to pay off the remaining balance of the bank mortgage entirely, which Helen did in person at the Caldwell Bank with a composure that only she could have maintained, though Patrick noticed that she held his hand on the walk home with a grip that told him she was feeling quite a lot more than she was showing. "It is ours," she said when they got back, standing at the gate with the letter C burned into the crossbeam. "Free and clear." "It was always yours," he said. "Now it is just officially free." She looked at the gate, then at the house beyond it, then at him. "It is ours," she said firmly. "Do not minimize your part in this." "I was not minimizing it. You were being self-effacing, which is your particular form of minimizing." He conceded this was probably accurate, and she squeezed his hand once and then walked through the gate in the purposeful way she had when something had been decided. By the summer of 1881, the Easton Ranch, as it had come to be called with Helen's eventual consent, was a going and growing concern. 3 years had transformed the modest, financially strained operation that Patrick had ridden up to in that autumn of 1878 into something that was genuinely solid, with a managed herd, well-maintained land, a clear and productive reputation in the Caldwell community, and people who would speak for its quality without being asked. Patrick had become a full member of the Caldwell community in the way that takes time and cannot be faked. He was on the committee for the County Cattlemen's Association, which he had joined at the suggestion of one of the neighboring ranchers, and which he found useful and occasionally interesting. He knew every family in the surrounding area by name and by the particular challenges they were working through, because he and Helen had both developed the habit of being the kind of neighbors that showed up when there was trouble and stayed until the trouble was managed. Helen had become something in the community that she had not quite been when Patrick arrived, though the roots of it had always been there. She was the person people asked for when they needed a straight assessment of a problem, whether it was a livestock question or a financial one, or something in the more complex territory of human affairs. She had a reputation for honesty that stopped just short of bluntness, and for a practicality that was warm enough not to be cold. Rosa said she had always been this way, but that having someone beside her who believed it completely had allowed it to fully emerge, and Rosa was not a woman who said things she did not mean. In the late summer of 1881, Helen told Patrick they were expecting again. He was in the corral when she came and told him, leaning on the fence watching the newest young horse move, a gray this time, and she came and stood beside him in her practical way and said it without ceremony, and he turned to look at her with the same fullness of feeling he had had the first time, which had not diminished in any way. "Another spring baby," he said. "So it seems." He reached out and touched her face with a hand that was still slightly rough from the morning's fence work. "Good," he said. She put her hand over his. "We will need another room. I will build it. You say that very confidently. I built Rosa's room. Rosa's room is adequate," she said, but she was smiling. "Our child will also have an adequate room," he said, "and I will build it with love if not with artistry." She laughed, leaning into his hand slightly, and the gray horse moved in the corral, and the late summer sun lay golden over everything, and there was nothing wanting in any direction that he could see. The second child was born in May of 1882, and was a girl, and arrived in the world with the combined authority of two people who had both been determined from the start. They named her Clara, which had been Helen's mother's name, and which Helen had been saving for exactly this purpose without having said so. And Clara Easton was from the first moments of her life an extremely opinionated individual who made her preferences known without delay. Edmund, who was 2 years old by this point, and had developed the particular lordly confidence of a firstborn who has had a great deal of adult attention, inspected his sister with the scientific interest of someone encountering a new phenomenon, and announced that she was very small, which was accurate. He warmed to her within the week, and by the end of the month was exhibiting a protective proprietary interest in her that Silas observed, accurately, would probably cause her no end of frustration as she grew older. The town of Caldwell continued to develop and change in the way of frontier towns in the 1880s, becoming more settled, more permanent feeling, the raw edges of the cattle town softening somewhat as more families arrived and more institutions took root. The church got its steeple straightened at last. A school was properly established, which interested Patrick and Helen for the obvious future reasons. The railroad was beginning to change the nature of the cattle trade across Kansas, making some things easier and other things more complicated, in the way that new technologies always do. Patrick and Helen adapted, as they adapted to everything, by talking it through carefully and making decisions together without either of them overriding the other. They argued sometimes, still, in the direct way of people who respected each other enough not to soften the substance of a disagreement. They always resolved it. That was the thing about them, the central thing, that resolution was not a surrender for either of them, but a destination they reached together. Silas retired in the fall of 1882, though retired was not quite the right word since he remained on the property, and involved himself in the operation to whatever degree his body and his preference allowed, which was considerably more than a younger man might have attempted. They built him a proper small house at the edge of the property, not the old cabin but a genuine house with a bedroom and a sitting room and a kitchen, and he moved into it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been properly recognized. "You did not have to do this," he said when they showed it to him. "Yes, we did," Helen said simply. He looked at the small house and then at Helen and Patrick and then back at the house. "Gerald Carter would be glad to see this," he said. "He would be glad to see all of it." Helen was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," she said. "I have spent 3 years trying to make something he would be proud of." "He would be," Silas said, "and not just the ranch." He did not say anything further because Silas was not a man who over-explained and he did not need to. The years moved in the way that good years do, which is to say faster than you would prefer, full of the daily texture of work and weather, and the particular joy of watching children grow, and the deeper satisfaction of a life that has been built on honest ground. Edmund started at the school when it was properly established, and proved to be serious about learning in the way his mother was serious about things, with a focus that occasionally needed to be redirected outdoors by his father, who knew the value of knowing when to put the book down and go look at something real. Clara was her own phenomenon entirely. She was interested in everything and afraid of nothing, which created regular moments of alarm for everyone around her. And she had developed, by the time she was walking confidently, a relationship with the horses that reminded Patrick of watching Helen in the corral that very first afternoon. The roan had long since moved to its new owner, but there were always horses on the Easton ranch, and Clara made her opinions about each of them known before she was old enough to ride. "She is going to be more trouble than any of us are ready for," Patrick said one evening, watching Clara attempt to climb the fence of the corral with focused ambition at the age of 2. "She is going to be magnificent," Helen said. Patrick looked at her. "You sound certain." "I am her mother," Helen said, as though this explained everything, which it did. There was a third child in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived with the same healthy vigor as his siblings, and who turned out to have his grandfather Edmund Easton's precise temperament, careful and methodical and deeply interested in how things worked. He was disassembling small objects for examination before he could speak full sentences, which both alarmed and delighted his parents. The ranch by this point was not a modest, struggling operation, but a genuine success by any honest accounting. The Easton name was known favorably in the county, which meant something in a community built on reputation and reliability. Patrick had become one of the people that newer ranchers came to when they needed to understand how things worked in Caldwell, and he gave advice the way his father had given loans, carefully, and with genuine interest in the other person's success. Helen had not shrunk or diminished or stepped back from any of the work of the ranch as the years went on and the children came. She had adapted as she always adapted, finding the forms of work that fit the current shape of her life, which included managing the accounts and the breeding records and the relationships with the buyers and the neighboring ranchers, while the heavier physical work had naturally redistributed among Patrick and the hands they employed. She was respected in Caldwell in a way that was specifically about her, not about being Patrick Easton's wife, which was a distinction that mattered to her and that the community seemed to understand. One October evening in 1885, Patrick was sitting on the porch in the last light of the day. Edmund was inside studying. Clara was in the barn attempting to teach Thomas something about horses that Thomas was too young to fully absorb, but was doing his best with. The air had the clear, cold, beautiful quality of Kansas autumn, and the land stretched out in the late golden light with the specific loveliness of a place that has been loved and worked and understood over time. Helen came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and they were quiet together for a while, The way people are quiet who have been together long enough that quiet is its own conversation. "I have been thinking," Helen said after a while, "about November of 1878. What about it? About the day you rode up to this porch." She looked out at the gate with the letter C on the crossbeam, still there, still the same. "I was so tired that day. I had been running this place alone for 7 months and I was making it work, but I was very tired, and I saw a stranger on a horse and I thought, here is another difficult thing." "I was a difficult thing," he agreed. "You were," she said. "You were the most unexpectedly good difficult thing that has ever happened to me." Patrick put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the way she always did, with that particular quality of trust that still moved him after 7 years of it, and they sat on the porch of their home in the autumn evening, and the children's voices came from the barn and the house, and the land was all around them in its clean and generous beauty. "I thought I was coming to settle a debt," he said. "I did not know I was coming to find my life." "No one ever knows that," she said quietly. "That is the particular mercy of how it happens." He held her and the evening deepened into the early dark, and the first stars appeared over the plains, and the light in the barn went yellow, and somewhere inside the house a lamp was lit, and from where they sat the whole small world of what they had built was warm and visible and real. He had come with a piece of paper and a cold purpose and a belief that a debt was a simple thing with a simple resolution. He had found a woman who had nothing to give him but herself, and she had been everything. He had come to collect and had been undone. He had arrived a creditor and become a debtor of the most complete kind, owing this woman, this land, this life, this family, everything that the word everything could contain. The debt of love was one he would spend his whole life gladly paying, and every morning when he woke to the Kansas sky and the sound of his children and the warmth of his wife, he counted himself richer than any promissory note had ever made a man. The stars came fully out over Caldwell, Kansas, on that October evening in 1885, the same stars that had hung over the frozen creek when he had told her he loved her, the same stars that had watched over the beginning of all of it, and the ranch was quiet and full and entirely at peace. And Patrick Easton held his wife on their porch and breathed the clean autumn air of a life that was, by any measure that mattered, exactly right.